Hey quilters, this is Sarah from Snugglebug Stitching, and today I'm about to get started working on my Rella's Diamonds quilt. This quilt is a pattern that I wrote for Benartex fabric. It is free and already available to you on the Benartex site. So if you'll check out the description of the video, I'll have the link for that pattern in there. And today I'm going to be working on cutting the pieces, and I'm going to show you some tips for cutting these fat quarters that I'm going to use for the foreground. And there will be a couple more tutorials using this quilt. So I'm going to do a tutorial on quilting paisleys and a tutorial for joining the ends of your binding with a diagonal seam. So go ahead and like this video, subscribe to my channel so that you'll know about it when those other tutorials drop. Now let's look at this fabric. I wrote this Rella's Diamond pattern specifically for this fabric. It is Benartex fabric. This line is Gratitude and Grace by Pat Sloan, and I love it. I'm super excited to start working with this. So what you're going to do, I've got this fat quarter bundle here. The fat quarter bundle is what we'll use for the foreground for the quilt. So you're going to go ahead and pick 7 fat quarters to make the diamond blocks and 10 fat quarters to make the sashing blocks and the 9 patch blocks. Go ahead and press them. If you want to use starch or pressing spray, go ahead and do that. Just a heads up, this pattern will have 4 time half square triangles, and those do have bias edges. So if those bother you, go ahead and use starch or pressing spray now to help tame that stretch a little bit. They've personally never bothered me, but if they do bother you, the starch will help. And go ahead and pick those fat quarters out, and I will meet you at the cutting table. Okay, quilters, so now that we have our fat quarters grouped, we have 7 fat quarters that we chose for the diamond blocks and 10 fat quarters that we chose to make our sashing and our 9 patch blocks. So I'm going to show you, first we'll start with the diamond blocks. I'm going to show you a quick and easy way to cut these squares that you need from these fat quarters. So your cutting instructions are going to say that you want to cut 4 8 3/4 inch squares from these fat quarters. So we're going to do 2 at a time. You could probably get away with 3. I wouldn't do more than that though. And first thing we're going to do is we are going to line these up, one edge up, and you want the other edge lined up somewhat, as much as you can. Depends on how your fat quarters are cut. And then we're going to turn this over, and we're going to fold these in half so that we have our long sides matching up. So now that we have that, I'm going to flip my cutting mat. I'm using an 18 by 24 inch cutting mat so that I can easily swap that around. And I've got a 16.5 inch square ruler that I'm going to be using for all of these cuts. You could use a 12.5 inch square ruler for this one and it would work fine. So we're going to take our ruler and we're going to lay it down on here, and we want it so that our 8.75 inch lines on both sides are well within our fabric. And you want to be sure, especially since the fat quarters are probably not cut to the exact size, you want to be sure that when you make these cuts around the 8.75 inch lines that you're actually cutting across all the fabric so that you don't have a square that's not the right size. So I have the fabric that is a little bit smaller on top so that I can see where I need to line that up. And I'm giving myself, you know, about a 1/4 inch extra. So let's line that up. And we're going to get our rotary cutter, and we're going to cut to the side, move the extra over for now, and to the top. And we're going to flip that cutting mat around. And this time we're going to line the 8.75 inch line up with this square line we just made and this square line we just made. All right, so there we have just cut 4 of our squares that we need from this. We'll need 25 total, so if you cut all 7, you'll have 28. You'll have 3 squares extra to play with. We're going to grab the other. And this technically should be a straight line, but moving the fabric might have messed that up. So I'm going to go a little bit over just make myself a new clean cut there. So I've got my 8.75 inch line within the fabric here and within the fabric down here. And you want to make sure that you have some clearance at the top here. So you don't want to have your ruler up past that top. And we'll do the same thing. Move this little extra out of the way. So by moving our cutting mat around and working that 18 by 24 inch cutting mat to our advantage, we don't have to move the fabric, which means if we move the fabric to try to turn it to cut it, then we have to try to line it back up again. But since we didn't have to move the fabric, that stays in place for us and we don't have to try to line it back up again. So we're going to line the 8.75 inch line down here up with this edge here and the 8.75 inch line here. We're going to line that up. And then we're just going to cut to the side and to the top. And we will repeat that until we have all 7 of our fat quarters for the diamond blocks cut and ready to go. And we will stack those onto some of the background pieces that we cut to make our half square triangles. Okay guys, so now we're going to cut our sashing and our 9-patch blocks. So I've got a couple fat quarters that I chose for that, ready to go. And you can cut 2, maybe 3 at a time, but I wouldn't do more than that. And the instructions for this one are going to say to cut 8 2.5 inch by 10.5 inch rectangles and 7 2.5 inch squares from these fat quarters. So I'm going to show you now an easy way to do that. So we're going to flip this upside down, but this time we're going to fold short side to short side. And I'm actually going to turn this over this way so that I can keep an eye on those selvages to be sure that I'm not cutting into those. So we're going to grab our ruler. I'm using a 16.5 inch square ruler. A 12.5 inch would work too. And we're going to cut from this, we're going to cut a 10.5 inch wide strip. So I'm just making sure here that my 10.5 inch line is well within these fat quarters and making sure that I'm catching both of them in this 10.5 inch line so that my squares aren't too small. So we're going to take that 10.5 inch line, cut that strip. Now we're going to move the ruler out of the way and I'm going to flip this mat just like we have been doing. And that allows me to move the mat and not the fabric, so the fabric stays put where I want it. And I'm going to line my 10.5 inch line with this side that I just squared off. So that's got the 10.5 inch strip. Now we're going to subcut that into our 8 2.5 inch strips. So I'm going to work my mat to my advantage, turn that around, and I'm going to line any line, it doesn't matter on my ruler, up with this bottom edge that we just squared off. And I'm just making sure that when I cut, I'll be catching all of that and also not getting the selvage into the cuts because I won't want that showing up in the quilt. And you can do a check really quick here. If you're going to cut 4 2.5 inch strips here, which since we've got it doubled over, that'll make our 8 rectangles. You want to be sure that your 10 inch line is within the fabric, and it is, and that'll make it so you'll be able to get those 4 strips. So let's make this cut. And then we'll flip that cutting mat around. And then we're going to start to subcut this into the 2.5 inch strips. So we're just going to go in increments of 2.5, and I'll start by lining my 10-inch line up with this edge here. Make that cut. And then we're going to go to our next 2.5 inch increment down, which is 7.5. And I'll line that line up. So there's 2 of them. Next increment down is 5. So line that up. There's 4. Next increment is 2.5. Line that up. So we've got 6 and 8. So that's all 8 of our 2.5 inch by 10.5 inch rectangles. And now we're going to cut those 2.5 inch squares. And there's 7 of them on the diagram because that's, you know, how many you'll need for that. You will have a bit left over, but it is actually easier to just go ahead and cut 8 of them. So it's up to you. You can unfold this and actually cut 7, or you can keep it folded up however you want to do that and cut 8. I'm going to cut 8 right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a new line just in case I got that a little off kilter when I was moving it around. So I'm going to have my 2.5 inch line within the fabric you see here. And it doesn't really matter if you have this bottom line lined up because I'm going to cut that off anyway. The only reason that would matter is if you had some really directional prints that you wanted to stay with the grain on that. But for these prints, it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to cut to the side. And while I'm there, I'm going to go ahead and square off that top. And then I'm going to flip my ruler around. And I'm going to line my 2.5 inch line up here with this side that we just made nice and square. Cut that excess off. And we're going to use the line that we cut, not the line that's still folded, and start lining up our cuts. So we're going to do 8 of them. And since it's folded over, we'll just do 4. So I'm going to start in increments of 10. I'm going to line the 10-inch line up with this right here, using those 2.5 inch increments. And I'm going to cut this side off. Now I'm going to go back to the next 2.5 inch increment, which is 7.5. So there's 2 of them. And then 5, line that 5 inch line up with the edge of that fabric. There's 4. And then line the 2.5 inch line up with the edge of that fabric. So that gives us 8 squares. You can take 1 extra out from each color if you want to. That's kind of up to you. I'm probably not going to bother with doing that because I'm going to have a little bit left over anyway, even if I just stuck to 7. So those are the cutting demos for the fat quarters. We'll do 7 of the diamond blocks and 10 of this sashing and 9-patch block cutting that I just showed you. And I'll also have a link in the description for some cutting diagrams that I made to go along with the pattern, just for people who like cutting diagrams for fat quarters. So I hope you like this, and I hope you stay tuned for some more demos that I have for this pattern.